The cafeteria noise stopped. Not gradually. Not with fading voices or shuffling trays. It stopped like someone had cut the power to sound itself. Emily's hand froze halfway to her mouth, the plastic spork trembling between her fingers. Around her, 200 women sat motionless, eyes fixed on the same point across the room. She followed their gaze to table 7, where a woman named Reese sat with blood dripping from her knuckles onto her untouched tray. No guards moved. No alarms sounded. Emily had been inside Coldwater Women's Correctional for 8 months. Long enough to know that silence here meant something different than it did outside. Silence was currency. Silence was survival. And right now, silence was a test she hadn't studied for. The woman across from her, Santos, a lifer with gray streaking through her black hair, leaned forward just enough to whisper without moving her lips. Don't look. Don't react. Eat. Emily's throat constricted. The oatmeal on her spork had gone cold and gelatinous. She forced it into her mouth anyway, the paste coating her tongue like wet concrete. Around her, the cafeteria gradually resumed its rhythm. Conversations restarted in careful increments. Trays scraped against tables. The overhead fluorescents hummed their constant, maddening note. But table 7 remained an island of stillness. Emily had learned the visible rules quickly. Commissary on Thursdays, yard time at 10, lights out at 9. She'd learned to keep her eyes down during count, to never touch another inmate's property, to respond to guards with "yes ma'am" and nothing more. These were the rules printed in the orientation handbook they'd given her on intake, when she'd still been wearing street clothes and crying. But the real rules, the ones that determined whether you survived or just existed, those were written in silence. In the way women moved through doorways. In who sat where. In which conversations stopped when you approached and which ones pulled you in like undertow. Cell Block D was her world now. 42 women in 21 cells, each one a universe of unspoken hierarchies and invisible boundaries. Her cellmate, a woman named Kira who'd been inside for 6 years on drug charges, had given her exactly one piece of advice the first night. There are 3 types of women in here, Kira had said, lying on the top bunk in the darkness. Ones who break, ones who bend, and ones who become something else entirely. You figure out which one you are before someone else decides for you. Emily had nodded, though Kira couldn't see her. She'd pulled the thin blanket up to her chin, listening to the sounds that prison made at night. Coughing from the cell next door. Someone crying 3 cells down, the sound muffled by a pillow. The steady rhythm of boots on concrete as guards made their rounds. And underneath it all, a silence so profound it felt like pressure against her eardrums. She hadn't known which type she was then. She still didn't dot in the yard that afternoon. Emily walked the perimeter with her hands in her pockets. The October air carried the smell of coming rain and institutional soap. A group of women played basketball on the cracked court, their shouts echoing off the 30-foot walls topped with razor wire. Others clustered in small groups, smoking contraband cigarettes or just standing, faces turned toward the pale sun. Santos fell into step beside her. The older woman moved with the economy of someone who'd learned to conserve energy, to never make unnecessary movements. You saw what happened this morning, Santos said. Not a question. I didn't see anything. The response came automatically now. Good. That's good. Santos pulled a cigarette from somewhere, lit it with a practiced motion that shielded the flame from the wind. But you felt it. Everyone felt it. Emily glanced at the guard towers. From this angle, she could see the silhouette of the officer on duty, backlit against the clouds. Watching. Always watching. Yet somehow never seeing what mattered. Reese had a debt, Santos continued, her voice barely audible over the yard noise. Been building for months. Finally came due. I don't want to know about. You need to know. Santos stopped walking, forcing Emily to stop too. Because debts work different in here. Outside you borrow money, you pay it back. Simple. In here, every interaction is a debt. Every favor. Every word. You take something, you owe. You stay silent when you should speak up, you owe. You speak when you should stay silent, you owe double. Emily's stomach turned over. She thought about the woman in her block who'd given her an extra blanket during the first cold snap. The guard who'd looked the other way when she'd been 30 seconds late to count. The kitchen worker who sometimes added an extra scoop to her tray. How much did she owe? I haven't taken anything from anyone, Emily said. Santos laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. You've been breathing their air for 8 months. You've been taking up space that could go to someone else. You think survival is free? The rain started then, fat drops that turned the concrete dark. Women began moving toward the doors, unhurried but purposeful. Emily followed, her mind racing. She'd thought she'd been invisible. Thought if she kept quiet, kept to herself, she could just serve her time and leave. But there was no invisibility here. Only different types of visibility. ACT2, the LED or the nightmare started 3 days after the cafeteria incident. Emily would wake in the darkness, Kira's breathing steady above her, unable to remember what she'd dreamed but carrying the weight of it in her chest like a stone. She'd lie there, counting the seconds between guard rounds, mapping the sounds of the cell block until they became a kind of music. During the day she started noticing things she'd missed before. The way certain women moved through the block like they owned it, while others pressed themselves against walls to let them pass. The complicated dance of eye contact and avoidance. The microtransactions happening constantly. A coveted item from commissary changing hands, a whispered warning, a debt acknowledged with nothing more than a nod. Kira had been right. Prison had its own economy, and Emily was just beginning to understand the currency. "You got a visitor today," Officer Martinez said during morning count, her voice flat as she checked Emily's name off the list. Emily's heart jumped. She'd put her mother on the approved visitor list, but they'd barely spoken since the sentencing. The shame had been too much, for both of them. The visiting room smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. Emily sat at one of the bolted-down tables, her hands folded in front of her, waiting. Other inmates talked in low voices with their visitors across the scratched plastic barriers. A child cried somewhere. A woman laughed, the sound startling and out of place. But the person who walked through the door wasn't her mother. It was James. Her ex-husband. The man whose testimony had put her here. Emily's entire body went rigid. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, could only stare at the man she'd once loved walking toward her with that familiar, apologetic expression that had always preceded his worst betrayals. "I know you probably don't want to see me," James said, sitting down across from her. He looked older. Tired. "But I needed to tell you something. Get out." Her voice came out strangled. "Emily, please. Just listen. You put me here." The words exploded out of her, loud enough that other visitors turned to look. "You lied on the stand. You made me look like I was the one. I know. I know what I did." James leaned forward, his voice dropping. "And I'm trying to make it right. I've been talking to a lawyer. About filing a motion to reconsider the evidence. About the money that actually went missing from the firm." Emily felt her world tilt. For 14 months since her arrest, she'd maintained her innocence. She'd told anyone who would listen that she hadn't embezzled anything, that the account discrepancies weren't her fault. But no one had believed her. Not the prosecutor. Not the jury. Not even her own defense attorney had seemed fully convinced. "Why now?" she whispered. James's eyes, those same blue eyes she'd once thought she could trust, filled with something that might have been guilt. "Because I can't live with what I did. Because watching you get convicted for something I knew wasn't entirely true. Emily, I should have spoken up then. I was scared. The firm was going to come after me if the truth came out, so you threw me under instead." Emily's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table. "You stood in court and told them I'd been acting suspicious. That I'd been the last one with access to those accounts. You corroborated every lie they told about me. I'm sorry." The words were inadequate, microscopic against the weight of what he'd done. "I know sorry doesn't fix this. But if I testify now, if I tell them what really happened, it's too late." Emily stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. "I'm already here. I've already lost everything. You don't get to feel better about yourself by trying to fix it now." She walked away from the table, toward the door where Officer Martinez stood waiting. Behind her she could hear James calling her name, but the sound was already fading, already becoming part of the background noise that filled every space in this place. Back in her cell, Emily sat on her bunk and stared at the wall. Kira was at her prison job in the library, so she had the space to herself. Rare privacy in a place where privacy didn't exist. Her mind kept circling back to James's words. A motion to reconsider. New evidence. The possibility, however slim, of an appeal. But underneath the fragile hope was something else. A question that made her stomach turn over. What would it mean to leave? 8 months ago she would have said it meant everything. Freedom. Her life back. A chance to rebuild. But now she wasn't sure. Because leaving would mean abandoning the careful equilibrium she'd found. The routines that had become armor. The silence she'd learned to weaponize. The woman she was becoming, harder, sharper, more dangerous than the woman who'd walked through those gates. A shadow fell across her cell. Emily looked up to find Santos standing at the bars. Heard you had a visit, the older woman said. News traveled fast here. Faster than it had any right to. It was nothing. Santos studied her with those dark, knowing eyes. Nothing doesn't make you look like you've seen a ghost. But that's your business. She paused. Just came by to let you know, there's a card game tonight. Cell 19. If you're interested. Emily had never been invited to one of the card games before. They happened a few times a week, moving from cell to cell, always after lights out. Gambling was forbidden, but that just meant the stakes were higher. Women bet commissary items, favors, information, anything that held value in the prison economy. I don't have anything to bet, Emily said. Santos smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. Everyone has something. ACT3, the price of Iandroi. The game started at 10:30. Emily slipped out of her cell while Kira pretended to sleep, moving through the darkened block with the same careful silence as the other women heading toward cell 19. 4 of them squeezed into the small space, sitting on the floor in a circle illuminated by a contraband battery-powered lamp. Santos. A woman named DeMarco who worked in the prison medical unit. Another woman Emily knew only as Birdie, who'd been inside for 12 years and had the kind of stillness that came from surviving unimaginable things. And Emily. The cards were soft from use, the numbers and suits nearly worn away. DeMarco dealt with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and sure. Buy-in is one story, Santos said, arranging her cards. Something true. Something that cost you to tell. Emily's throat went dry. I don't. You want in, you pay the price. Birdie's voice was rough as sandpaper. Those are the rules. The other women looked at their cards, waiting. Emily felt the weight of their attention, heavy as iron. My ex-husband visited today, she heard herself say. The man who testified against me at trial. He says he wants to help me appeal. Says he'll tell the truth about what really happened. The words hung in the air between them. DeMarco raised her eyebrows slightly. Santos's expression didn't change. And? Birdie prompted. And I told him it was too late. Emily stared at her cards without seeing them. But I don't know if I meant it. Santos nodded slowly. Truth. Good enough. She laid down her first card. Now we play. They played for 2 hours. Emily lost the first 3 hands, won the 4th, lost again. The stakes climbed, a pack of cigarettes, a bar of real chocolate from commissary, a favor to be named later. But the real currency was the stories that DeMarco told them about the daughter she hadn't seen in 7 years, who'd been adopted by another family and no longer answered her letters. Birdie described the night she'd killed her stepfather, her voice flat and emotionless as she recounted details that made Emily's blood run cold. Santos talked about the woman she'd loved on the outside, who'd promised to wait but had married someone else within 6 months. Each story was a kind of violence. Each one drew blood. You're thinking about taking the deal, Santos said during a break between hands. It wasn't a question. Emily shook her head. There's no deal. Just a possibility. And even if he does testify, even if the court agrees to hear new evidence, the chances of actually getting out, that's not what I asked. Santos leaned back against the wall. I asked if you're thinking about it, if part of you is already planning what you'd do on the outside, where you'd go, who you'd be. The silence in the cell pressed down like a physical weight. Yeah, Emily whispered. I'm thinking about it. DeMarco gathered the cards, began shuffling. You know what the worst part about hope is? It's not when you lose it. That's almost a relief, actually. The worst part is when you get just enough of it to keep you from adapting. From becoming what you need to be to survive in here. Hope's a luxury, Birdie added. Like hot showers and privacy. Nice if you can afford it. Deadly if you depend on it. The game broke up around 1 in the morning. Emily made her way back to her own cell, her mind churning. She climbed into bed and lay there, listening to Kira's breathing, to the sounds of the prison settling into its night rhythms. That in the morning, everything changed. The call came during breakfast. Dawson. Cell 19. Now. Emily's blood turned to ice. She set down her tray and followed Officer Martinez through the corridors, her mind racing through possibilities. Had they been caught gambling? Had someone reported the night game? But when Martinez opened the cell door, Emily found Santos sitting on the lower bunk, her face a mask of controlled fury. Birdie's in the infirmary, Santos said without preamble. Someone put glass in her food. Emily's stomach dropped. Is she? She'll live. Assuming infection doesn't set in. Santos stood up. But whoever did it, they made their point. What point? That there are consequences for talking out of turn. for saying things that shouldn't be said. Santos's eyes locked onto Emily's. Birdie told us about killing her stepfather last night. But she left out one detail: he was a corrections officer. At this prison. 15 years ago. The implications crashed over Emily like a wave. Birdie had killed a guard. And someone, maybe another guard, maybe an inmate with connections, had decided she needed to be reminded that some secrets were meant to stay buried. But we were alone, Emily said. It was just the four of us. Santos shook her head. Walls have ears. Cells have eyes. You think because it's dark and quiet that we're invisible? There's no such thing as privacy here. There's only the illusion of it, and we buy that illusion by staying useful to the people who really run this place. I don't understand. You don't have to. Santos moved to the cell door, looked out at the empty corridor. But you need to decide something, Dawson. Your ex-husband shows up, offers you hope. The same day one of us gets hurt for telling the truth. You think that's coincidence? Emily felt cold. You think James coming here had something to do with? I think nothing happens here by accident. I think the guards know about every game, every deal, every secret we think we're keeping. And I think they use that information to keep us exactly where they want us, divided, scared, and desperate enough to do whatever they ask. ACT-4. The RECON into the investigation into Birdie's injury was cursory at best. She claimed she didn't know how glass had gotten into her food. No one had seen anything. The guards filed a report and moved on. But in the cell block, the message had been received. Emily watched women she'd started to trust retreat into silence. The card game stopped. Conversations became shorter, more careful. Even Kira, usually talkative, spent their evenings in near total quiet. A week after Birdie was attacked, Emily received another visitor request. James again. This time she almost didn't go. But something, curiosity, desperation, the ghost of who she used to be, made her walk into that visiting room and sit down across from the man who destroyed her life. I filed the motion, James said immediately. My lawyer thinks we have a real shot. The firm's CFO retired last month, and there's been some irregularities in how they've handled the investigation. If we can show that the evidence was compromised, that you were scapegoated, stop. Emily's voice was quiet but firm. Just stop. James blinked. What? I need you to answer something honestly, and I'll know if you're lying. She leaned forward. Who asked you to visit me? The flicker of confusion in his eyes looked genuine. What? No one. I told you I wanted to make things right. The day after you showed up, Emily said, a woman in my block was assaulted. Someone who'd been inside for 12 years, who'd learned how to survive by being invisible. And suddenly, right after you appear talking about appeals and new evidence, she becomes a target. James shook his head. That has nothing to do with, everything in here is connected. Every action has consequences that ripple out in ways you can't imagine. Emily stood up. You want to make things right? Then stay away. Don't file any motions. Don't send lawyers. Don't try to save me. Because every time you do, someone in here pays the price. You can't mean that. Emily, this is your chance to get out. Maybe I don't want out anymore. The words surprised her even as she said them. Maybe I've finally figured out how things work. Maybe I've become something different than the woman you knew. She walked away before he could respond, her heart pounding. But she felt something else too. Something that might have been clarity. That night, Emily asked Kira the question she'd been avoiding for months. What did you do to survive your first year? Kira was quiet for a long moment. Then, I stopped being who I was on the outside. I stopped holding on to the person I thought I should be and became the person this place needed me to be. Which is someone who understands that survival isn't about staying clean or keeping your conscience clear. It's about understanding power, who has it, what they want, and what you're willing to trade to stay breathing. Kira shifted on the upper bunk. You know what your problem is, Dawson? You still think you're temporary. Like this is just a phase you have to get through before real life starts again. But this is real life. These walls, these women, these rules, this is what's real now. Everything else is just memory. Emily lay in the darkness, thinking about James and his appeals. About Birdie and the glass in her food. About the invisible ledgers that tracked every debt, every favor, every word spoken and unspoken. And she thought about Santos's question. Which type of woman would she become? One who broke. One who bent. Or one who became something else entirely. In the morning, she found Santos in the yard. I need to know something, Emily said. About the card game. About what happened to Birdie. Santos lit a cigarette, her eyes scanning the yard automatically, always watching. Ask. You knew it wasn't safe. You knew walls had ears. But you invited me anyway. Why? Because you needed to understand what truth costs in here. Santos exhaled smoke. Your ex shows up, waves hope in front of you like it's free. But nothing's free. I wanted you to see that before you made a choice you couldn't take back. And Birdie? You sacrificed her to teach me a lesson? Santos's expression hardened. I sacrificed nothing. Birdie made her own choice when she told that story. She knew the risks. We all do, every time we open our mouths. She paused. But yeah, I used the timing. Because you needed to see that hope isn't salvation, it's just another form of death. Emily should have been angry. Should have felt betrayed. But all she felt was a strange kind of understanding. James filed a motion for appeal, she said. I know. Everyone knows. I'm going to tell him to withdraw it. Santos nodded slowly. Smart. That's not why. Emily turned to face the older woman fully. I'm doing it because I understand now. Every time someone tries to save me, someone else pays. Every time I hold on to hope of getting out early, I'm creating a debt I can't repay. So I'm done. I'm done being the person things happen to. And what are you going to be instead? Emily looked up at the guard towers, at the razor wire gleaming in the weak sunlight, at the concrete walls that enclosed her entire world. Someone who survives, she said. On my own terms. 3 months later, Emily sat in Santos's cell with DeMarco and 2 other women. Birdie was still in medical, recovery slow but steady. The cards moved between them with practiced efficiency. When it was Emily's turn to tell her story, she spoke about the letter she'd written to James. About how she'd explained that she was withdrawing consent for any appeals, any motions, any attempts to reduce her sentence. That she would serve her full time, another 6 years, and walk out with no debts, no obligations, no strings attached. And how did that feel? DeMarco asked. Emily thought about it. About the weight that had lifted when she dropped that letter in the outgoing mail. About the clarity that had come from finally accepting where she was and who she was becoming. Like I was finally in control of something, she said. The game continued. Hours passed. Stories were traded like currency, each one a small piece of armor against the world outside the circle. When Emily finally returned to her cell, she climbed into her bunk and lay in the darkness, listening to the prison breathe around her. She thought about the woman she'd been 14 months ago, walking through those gates in handcuffs, terrified and confused and certain that her real life had ended as she'd been right about that much. But what she hadn't understood then, what she understood now, was that endings were just beginnings in different skin. The woman who would walk out of Coldwater in 6 years wouldn't be the woman who'd walked in. She wouldn't be innocent or victimized or tragic. She'd be something harder. Something that had learned to survive by embracing the truth of where she was instead of clinging to the fantasy of where she should have been. She'd be someone who understood that freedom wasn't about walls or gates or sentences served. It was about accepting the price of your choices and deciding whether you'd pay it on someone else's terms or your own. In the darkness, Emily closed her eyes. And for the first time since her conviction, she slept without dreaming.